Every great empire has a secret expiration date, 250 years. Assyria lasted 247 years. Persia and Britain both collapsed after 250 years. In 2025, the United States reaches year 249. This is not just decline, it is biology repeating itself, right on schedule. If Glubb was right, there is 1 year left on the clock. What does history look like in its final hour? And is there any way to break the cycle? Sir John Glubb was not a theorist in an ivory tower. He was a soldier, a colonial administrator, and a witness to empires in both their rise and their ruin. Born in 1897, he served in the trenches of the First World War, then spent decades in the deserts of Iraq and Jordan, commanding the Arab Legion through the collapse of the old Ottoman order and the twilight of British power. By the time he published his essay, The Fate of Empires, in 1976, he had seen the heart of empire from the inside and watched it fail. Glubb's claim was simple and unsettling. After studying 3,000 years of imperial history, he noticed a strange uniformity. Empires, no matter their culture, religion, or technology, lived for roughly the same span, about 250 years, not as a rigid law, but as an average, a pattern that repeats with eerie precision. In his words, the duration of great empires has averaged around 250 years. He compiled a list. Assyria, 247 years. Persia, just over 2 centuries. The Arab Caliphate, 246 years. The Ottoman Empire, 250 years. Spain, 250 years. Britain, 250 years. The numbers did not match exactly, but they clustered tightly, as if each empire carried a hidden expiration date, ticking from the moment of its first conquests to the day it lost real power. Glubb's method was clinical. He defined the start as the moment a people banded together and began expanding outward, and the end as the loss of independence, the collapse, or the reduction to a second-rate power. It did not matter if the flag changed or if the city survived. What mattered was the end of dominance, the moment the body could no longer fight. This was not a theory about kings or parliaments. It was not about good luck or bad decisions. Glubb saw empires as living organisms. They were born, they grew, they reached maturity, and then, inevitably, they decayed. The 250-year cycle was not a prophecy. It was an autopsy report, written by a man who had watched the same symptoms appear again and again, across continents and centuries. The question was no longer whether an empire could last forever. The question was why they all seemed to die at the same age. Every pattern needs a ruler. Glubb's ruler was brutally simple. An empire begins when it breaks out, when a people once fragmented or provincial suddenly start expanding, conquering, and consolidating power. It ends not with the last king or the final flag, but with a decisive loss of independence, a collapse, or a reduction to secondary status. No shifting the goalposts after the fact. The yardstick is set at the moment of expansion and the moment of irreversible decline. This is not a trick of cherry-picked dates. Glubb insisted on operational clarity. Start with the first major conquests, end with the final loss of power. For Assyria, that meant the rise out of regional obscurity around 859 BC. And the catastrophic fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. For Britain, it was the surge to global dominance around 1700 and the post-war retreat to an island nation by 1950. The same logic applies across the board. Different scholars might argue over a decade here or there, but the pattern is stubborn. Shift the start or end by 10 years, and the cycle still hovers near 250 years. Imagine the numbers sliding on a timeline. Move Assyria's beginning or end by a decade in either direction, and its lifespan barely budges. Do the same for Britain, or the Ottomans, or the Arab Caliphate. The result is the same, a tight cluster, not a scatter. The cycle is not a myth built on arbitrary lines. It survives the test of honest arithmetic. Before the data, before the charts, the method stands exposed. The rule is clear, the measurement is visible, and the clock is set. With that ruler in hand, the next step is to see what the numbers actually say. Assyria's imperial clock began in 859 BC when a loose collection of city-states hardened into a war machine that dominated the ancient Near East. For nearly 2.5 centuries, Assyria expanded, taxed, and terrorized its neighbors. Then in 612 BC, Nineveh fell. The empire was erased. The duration was 247 years. Persia, under the Achaemenids, led by Cyrus and his descendants, swept across Mesopotamia and Asia Minor beginning in 538 BC. They built roads, minted coins, and ruled from Egypt to India. By 330 BC, Alexander's armies had burned Persepolis and toppled the Persian throne. The Achaemenid story lasted 208 years. Britain's imperial arc is more recent, more familiar. The rise began around 1700 as wooden ships and joint stock companies carried British power to every continent. By the mid-20th century, the empire that once claimed a quarter of the Earth's land had been reduced to an island, its colonies independent, its navy eclipsed. The imperial phase lasted 250 years. 3 empires, 3 very different worlds. Yet the numbers cluster: 247 years, 208 years, 250 years. Not 1,000, not 500, just long enough for 10 generations to be born, grow old, and forget how the empire started. The pattern is not perfect, but it is stubborn. Shift the timeline by a decade, and the average barely moves. This is not a coincidence of kings or constitutions. It is something deeper, a biological clock ticking beneath each civilization's skin. A new empire never begins with comfort. It starts with hunger, literal and metaphorical. The Age of Pioneers is not a myth. It is the record of desperate men and women who gamble everything on a future they cannot see. In the American case, the clock starts with the Revolution, 13 scattered colonies, outmatched and outgunned, forcing their way into existence through risk, sacrifice, and a willingness to endure. These were not the well-fed heirs of empire. They were, in Glubb's words, poor, hardy, and restless, driven as much by necessity as by vision. Frontier mentality was not a slogan, but a survival strategy. Every mile west was a wager, every winter a test. The early republic was built by people who measured their worth in sweat and scars. They cleared forests, built cabins, raised militias, and fought for territory against both nature and rivals. The military ethos was not confined to soldiers. It ran through the population from the backwoods to the town square. In these years, citizenship and service were nearly synonymous. The army was not a distant professional caste, it was the nation in arms. As the land expanded, so did ambition. The age of conquest followed, marked by a series of wars and annexations. The United States doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase, pushed its borders through treaties and battlefields, and sent explorers and settlers into lands unknown. The risks were real, the rewards uncertain. Yet the logic was always the same: forward, outward, more. Commerce was the next layer. Railroads stitched the continent, merchant ships crowded new ports, trade networks wove together distant regions. The merchant class rose alongside the generals, building fortunes on cotton, timber, and steel. Cities grew from muddy crossroads to centers of wealth. For a time, the virtues of the pioneer, discipline, thrift, endurance became the engine of national prosperity. But every step toward comfort carried a hidden cost: the slow, almost invisible exchange of risk for routine, of sacrifice for stability. The empire's body was growing strong, but already the first signs of middle age were settling in. Affluence arrives quietly, almost as a reward for centuries of struggle. The empire's body, once lean and restless, settles into comfort. Incomes rise across the board. Houses grow larger, wardrobes multiply, and the hunger for necessities fades into a hunger for novelty. Consumption no longer means survival, it means display. The old virtues, thrift, self-restraint, sacrifice, are replaced by the pursuit of pleasure and ease. Grand public works and luxury projects become the signature of the age: palaces, museums, theaters, and sprawling parks built not for defense or necessity, but for the enjoyment of those who have already won. The affluent class, once a thin layer of merchants and officials, expands. More citizens can afford imported silks, fine foods, and the latest amusements. Cities fill with shops and entertainments. The economy, once driven by expansion and risk, now orbits around comfort and consumption. Credit and speculation flourish. The language of duty, service, sacrifice, the common good, fades from public life, replaced by a language of entitlement and personal fulfillment. This is the turning point Glubb described. Wealth, after a generation or two, begins to erode the very instincts that built it. The empire's arteries clog with luxury. Its muscles soften with inactivity. The children of conquerors and builders inherit not only their fortunes, but their distance from hardship. The idea of struggle becomes abstract, a story told in school books rather than lived experience. The body of the empire, once hardened by necessity, now grows heavy and slow, content to enjoy what others earned. Beneath the surface, the pivot is complete. Comfort has replaced duty. The next phase is not about what people do, but what they think and what they argue about. The age of intellect arrives not with revolution, but with a quiet swelling of voices. The empire, once defined by risk and building, now devotes its energy to thinking, talking, and debating. Universities multiply. The number of scholars, lawyers, and experts expands far beyond what the state or the economy actually needs. Knowledge becomes the new currency, and credentials the ticket to status. In earlier generations, the heroes were soldiers and builders. Now the highest praise is reserved for those who can argue, theorize, or persuade. This is the era of the credential explosion. In the United States, the number of college degrees awarded each year has grown from fewer than 500,000 in the 1960s to nearly 2 million today. Graduate schools churn out more lawyers, MBAs, and PhDs than there are positions for, creating a surplus of educated elites. The same pattern appeared in late Rome, in Ottoman Istanbul, in the final centuries of the Qing dynasty. An expanding class of intellectuals, each hoping for influence, each convinced they have the answer. Credential pressure builds in libraries and lecture halls, not on the battlefield. The result is a society obsessed with ideas, but increasingly detached from action. Arguments over policy, identity, and theory fill the air. Think tanks, op-ed pages, and academic journals become the battlegrounds. The old virtues, discipline, sacrifice, and work are replaced by cleverness, critique, and performance. The body of the empire, once muscular and restless, now sits in endless discussion, convinced that every problem can be solved by the right plan or the right words. But as the talking grows louder, the ability to act grows weaker. The energy that once conquered continents is now spent on debate, and beneath the surface, the empire's immune system is quietly breaking down. The next phase is not about argument or ambition, it is about survival. The body of empire weakens first at its core. When the call to arms goes out, fewer answer. In the United States, the all-volunteer force has struggled to meet recruiting targets year after year. By the late 2000s, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Pentagon records show private contractors outnumbered uniformed troops on the ground, over 95,000 contractors to 95,800 soldiers in Iraq alone. Today, hundreds of thousands of contractors fill roles once held by citizen soldiers, from logistics to security, from maintenance to armed support. The fighting force is no longer the nation in arms. It is a hired machine, maintained by contracts and invoices. Meanwhile, the empire's treasury turns inward. In 1950, less than a quarter of federal spending went as direct payments to individuals. By 2019, that share had climbed to nearly 2/3. Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, what began as a safety net now absorbs the majority of outlays. The system pays not to build or defend, but to pacify and to sustain. Bread and circuses, updated for the digital age. The empire's strength is spent keeping itself calm, even as its muscles atrophy. The spotlight shifts from generals and builders to chefs, athletes, and influencers. Sir John Glubb wrote that in the end, men write books about cooking rather than conquering. In the United States, the best-selling authors are not statesmen, they are celebrity chefs. Television and social media elevate entertainers to the status once held by explorers and inventors. The most followed Americans are not public servants, but pop stars and athletes. Meanwhile, the capital city draws people from every corner of the world. In 1970, less than 5% of Americans were foreign-born. Today, that figure stands at nearly 14% nationwide, and in the nation's capital, about 1 in 5 residents was born abroad. The wealth of empire acts like a magnet, attracting talent and ambition, but also diluting the original sense of shared purpose. The old consensus fractures. Surveys show that over half of Americans now see the other side not just as rivals, but as threats to the nation itself. Polarization has climbed to levels not seen in generations. The body of empire, once unified by vision and sacrifice, now fights itself in a fever of mutual suspicion. The symptoms are not unique. They are the same patterns that closed the curtains on Assyria, Persia, and Britain. Arithmetic is waiting in the wings. Take the founding date, 1776. Add the number that keeps repeating across the centuries, 250. The sum is 2026. That is not a prophecy. It is arithmetic. The United States, by this measure, stands in year 249. The same interval that separated the rise and fall of Assyria, the same 2.5 centuries that carried Britain from wooden ships to atomic bombs. The pattern does not care about technology or intention. It is a biological clock, winding down. The numbers do not flinch. Year 249 means the final page is already in the typewriter. No speeches, no reforms, no distractions can erase the equation. 1776 plus 250 equals 2026. The cycle is almost complete. The only question left is whether anyone will notice before the clock strikes midnight. Right now, the world's largest military employs more private contractors than soldiers. Celebrity chefs headline the news more often than explorers. The patterns. Glubb tracked are not just ancient, they are visible in today's headlines. If history is a script, we are running out of pages. The next chapter is not written yet, but for once, we know exactly what is at stake. What would you do with the final year?